That's like this. Okay, so we're getting started. So if everybody could just give us a little bit of silence for a quick second. So my name is Anthony Rios. I'm the president of College Democrats at Stevens, and I'm happy to welcome you guys to the first ever College Republican debate. So we have Alex, Sean, Kermit, and Aaliyah, and we have Thomas, Robbie, Justin, and Jackson. And then we have Professor Mullen, Professor Cormack, and Professor Tom. Our topics we'll be debating tonight are climate change, immigration, and gun reform. And there is also pizza in the back. Also, Professor Mullen would like me to tell you if there is an event this Thursday that the Law Society is having, and if you're interested in working on a personal statement or interested in law school generally, you're happy to attend that as well. Well, without further ado, I will get out of the way and let the debate start.
What? Okay, well, you need to flip the coin.
Yeah.
Right coin.
Or try something.
Where do you guys start? You went and stood up and everything. We're doing that for the world. Then we'll
Okay,
start the next one.
well,
There we go.
Before I even start, I'd like to thank my compatriots for being here, such a large audience for having shown up, our moderators for having given us their time, and our opponents for having shown up, because without any of those components, this kind of wouldn't be possible. So thank you all for being here. With that out of the way, I will start my time now. Okay, so apparently we only have a minute to make an opening statement, so in the interest of time, I'm going to skim a lot of details, and if you need more detail, you can either refer to the source list that we will send all of you after the debates. First, climate change is real and man-made. We have posted evidence of that, and you can go read that, but it's not really a productive debate to have. Equipped to solve. We will see significant impacts of climate change that we're both dealing with, such as agricultural impacts in the West with significant damage to water stress, because as things heat up, obviously there will be less water to go around in the West. Additionally, wildfires. We've already seen this in the West a lot. Of the 20 wildfires, the largest ones in California's recorded history, 15 have occurred since 2000. This correlates to climate change. I have an entire personal experience with this in my hometown that I can elaborate on in past. Additionally, in tropical regions, crop yields will decrease significantly in the long term by around 25%. This could lead to famines and also economic detriments. We'll have significant flooding. Oh my God, it's already been a minute.
You have 30 seconds.
30
Oh, okay.
30 seconds gone.
Minute 30.
So, famines, flooding. The Secretary of Defense already thinks it's a problem. Trump already thinks it's a problem in his business dealings. This is likely to create 20 million displaced people who we will have to deal with. Since the world cannot boycott the oil companies that contribute the majority to this problem, we must rely on government to solve it through things like reevaluation of subsidization and incentivization of development of technologies. Thank you.
So, to begin, we also believe that climate change is real. We're not going to argue that the Earth has not been warming because the science says it does. But what the science does not tell us is what the future holds. There really is no scientific consensus for predicting what climate change is going to do and the effects of that. They've been trying to predict it for many years, and not many of their predictions have come true. The UN 30 years ago predicted that today the Earth would have warmed by at least 3 degrees. It warmed by about half a degree. They predicted that Dust Bowl conditions would return to the US and that entire nations would be underwater in 2019. None of that became true. So while climate change is real, we just do not believe that it is as much of a crisis as the other side believes. Most of their proposals seem very extreme. A lot of them could ruin the economy of the US and the world. Under President Trump, fracking has taken off, and that is actually the reason for most of the US carbon emission reductions. There are also many other Republicans proposing solutions for climate change. Dan Crenshaw, he is a big proponent of carbon capture, which has led to net zero emission power plants in Texas. And we think that we should keep pushing those policies, ones that are practical and things that aren't going to destroy the economy or completely change our society's energy infrastructure.
All right, now we have questions from the moderators. Joyce, would you like to start? In general, well, in fact, there's been a study recently that scientists have not been accurately advising people about the rate of climate change, but the study seems to indicate that they've been too conservative about predicting change, and that many of the things that they thought would be far off in the future are happening as we speak. The tropical rainforests being eroded, the wildfires, the earthquakes, the hurricanes, the tornadoes have been happening at a much faster rate than was initially predicted. So any thoughts about that? That there seems to be different studies being quoted and they're not all consistent.
So we'll have a minute from each team responding to this.
Okay. I would completely agree with you that all the studies are not consistent. I was reading some studies on NASA's website, and their statistics for what they predict the sea levels are going to rise differ greatly. They predict that by 2030 it's going to rise by anywhere from 0.3 feet to 0.6 feet, and then by 2100 from 1 foot to 4 feet. So those are like very, very different statistics when it comes to the effects of this sea level rising. So that's what I said before.
From NASA?
We don't really feel like, what?
From NASA?
Yeah.
You said?
Yeah, those are on their website. And if it rises by 1 foot or 0.3 feet or 4 feet, those are going to have drastically different effects on the Earth. So we just don't really think it's rational to be proposing all of these extreme plans to combat something that we don't know what's going to happen with it. And we could just be like hurting the economy, hurting the American people and the world for what's really nothing.
Okay. Your side?
Okay.
So to go along with NASA statistics, it's also shown from a study published by NASA that some of the top 5 hottest years on record were within the past decade, with 2018 being the 4th hottest ever recorded. It's a trend that's just been getting worse and worse, and it's been more and more exacerbated. We're not at the same levels that it was at in 2015, but it's still quite bad. You keep bringing up the economy specifically, saying that the overall economic impacts of trying to tackle climate change in a aggressive manner would be ill-feasible for the United States and for the worldwide itself. Yet the average cost of producing solar and wind power as compared to fossil fuel rates currently is actually cheaper per kilowatt hour, whereas investing in said green renewable energies would be cost effective in the long run.
So, with given the so-called science of climate coming up and the lack of any consensus, I think it's more NOAA than NASA that does this kind of thing. Would anyone like to explain how NOAA has to keep changing their data to make it look like things are rising, and the NOAA data from 2018, in order for it to be quote the hottest on record, has to be used for by CO2 and not by temperature. They use a surrogate to make that come out. Anyone care to comment on that?
We'll start here and then we'll
I believe the main reason with that is trying to aggregate the actual temperature of the atmosphere is a pretty arduous task in and of itself to try and get a true global perspective on the overall temperature. Measuring average CO2 rates is a more accurate science to a degree, and it's one that can be more measured in a sense. It allows for a nice correlation of data to be able to see if averaging temperatures do correspond to increasing carbon emissions in the atmosphere.
Well, I would like to kind of go off of that a little bit with the notion of it being measuring the temperature in the atmosphere would seem to be an arduous task, something that can't necessarily be measured consistently across the entire Earth. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense that we can make a full prediction of the climate of the entire Earth. We can't, let alone make a simple prediction about the temperature. So it would seem odd that in a place where, for example, in Michigan, where the temperatures on average have been being on the most temperate they've been on record, they've been the most consistent, versus a place like California where it's been warming up. It seems like a small difference like that, you can't really make a full consensus on everything if places varying just across one whole country change by that much.
Okay, to both teams, I'd like to know what exactly is it that you'd like to change in U.S. policy towards climate change? We can start with the Republicans for this one.
We think that it would be much more beneficial for the United States as a whole to shift federal and state subsidies away from dirty coal and dirtier fossil fuels and move them towards renewables like solar, wind, hydroelectricity, and even nuclear energy, even though it's really not renewable. But that doesn't even really involve climate change solely. It also involves the other pollutants that come from burning fossil fuels. Not only that, we would also like to see, like Professor mentioned before, areas are going to be seeing increased severity of hurricanes and tornadoes and things like this. We would also
In red
like
states.
I'm sorry, what?
They're in red states, many of them.
But the state doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is that we set some kind of a updated federal building code that even if the conditions don't warm like we think they will, we're prepared to take it.
So your position is shift subsidies and update building codes to be more resilient?
Yes.
Is that right? Okay. And Democrats, your position?
We have a minute?
Yep.
Okay. We would agree with much of what the Republicans have said. We would agree with shifting funds away from many dirty sources of energy and shifting them towards incentivization of green energy by, for example, removing tax breaks for fossil fuel corporations and extending tax incentives for renewable energy, including nuclear options such as liquid fluoride thorium reactors and uranium pellet reactors, which have proven much safer than the nuclear technology of the past. Additionally, we should rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. If we believe that we can make the goals that are set by the Paris Climate Accord, and we are reading them already, then why not rejoin? It's a statement of goodwill. The entire world got together and said that this is an issue we should tackle. Nothing in it is actually binding. It's simply the reason it was a big deal internationally was that it was a statement of goodwill that we all agreed this was an issue worth solving. So we should rejoin that in order to reaffirm our commitment to those issues. Basically that. We agree that we should invest in those sources, and also, I have 3 seconds, but also rejoin Paris Climate Accord. Thank you.
Okay, college Republicans, you've had the opportunity to ask the Democrats one question. What question have you prepared?
Okay, so the Green New Deal, which was proposed by Congresswoman AOC and endorsed by many of the Democratic candidates for president, it's supposed to be a solution to climate change, but it also includes many socialist economic reforms like free college, guaranteed housing, guaranteed work. First of all, do you support the Green New Deal, and why do you think so many leftist economic policies have been put into an environmental policy?
You have 1 minute to respond.
Okay. Well, having not read the deal in detail, I wouldn't describe myself as being qualified to comment explicitly on it, but as well, it was a non-binding resolution, not an actual bill, and it was also voted down by every Democrat in the House. The only one who was actually for it was Ocasio-Cortez herself, and maybe a couple of others, I believe, but it was very strongly voted down, so it doesn't really represent mainstream Democratic policy position. And in addition, much of Democratic policy position regarding this involves expansion of government, or involves government doing most of the work, because it is the belief that the private sector mostly profits off of continuing the problem, and that since people cannot effectively boycott many of the private sector forces, such as oil companies, who are pursuing this problem, it is government who must handle this issue, because essentially, if you can't vote for your wallet, the only vote you have left is the vote in your government. And so government is essential to solve this problem in the long run. So that's why larger government solutions are the ones often being pursued, though the Green New Deal is not representative of mainstream democratic ideas.
All right, and your question, you can reply to it in the closing statement. Your question for the Democrats? Or for the Republicans, excuse me?
Do you believe that rejoining the Paris Accords is important? And if so, how would you see that impacting like global policy?
So no, we do not believe that we need to rejoin the Paris Accords, and like you just said over there, nothing in it was binding. It was just a gesture of goodwill, but the issue was that countries like China and India, they basically pledged to do nothing. China said, oh yeah, we'll like take care of climate change like in the next few decades, whereas President Obama pledged way too much. That's where I was talking about the economic detriment of these plans. It was going to cost millions of jobs, trillions of dollars. The issue isn't the point that it's a gesture of goodwill. I think we should show that to the world that we're committed to combating climate change, and we've reduced emissions more than every country in the world, and that's mainly due to fracking, which was boosted by President Trump. But the issue with the climate accords is that President Obama promised way too much, and it was going to hurt the country.
Okay, you all have a minute to provide your thoughts, and then you have your closing statements.
Yeah, countries set the right goals.
I know, I totally agree. All right. College Republicans, you're going to have the first word in the closing here. You have 45 seconds for your closing statement.
To reiterate, we believe that climate change is man-made. We don't think it's severe enough to warrant extreme government action. We think that the free market, an educated free market, would be able to put forward solutions to a lot of technical problems involving climate change, would be able to make renewable energy profitable so that it will be adopted over coal and over gas. We want a lot of consumers to act in the interest of the climate and say, if they have the option between things like driving a car and biking or walking, they choose the one that's more environmentally friendly, especially in a lot of urban areas where people tend to live. This is definitely feasible, but in general, we don't think that the way to solve this crisis is through the government. Thank you.
Okay. And Democrats?
It's in our opinion that the United States should make an effort nearly immediately to join the Paris Climate Accords, even if Obama set lofty goals, as you may describe. The U.S. is able to change what we're actually set at. It's not one big body saying this country must do this country must do this. We set our own standards. In regards to fracking, yes, it has brought in a large number of revenue for the United States, but green energy jobs are on the rise, whereas jobs in the fossil fuel industry tend to be on decline, so it would be an overall boost to the economy. And you just mentioned green transportation mechanisms of biking or stuff like that. For many large groups of people, particularly in urban and some suburban areas, that's not a practical solution. And so it's more of an effort to try to address the carbon emissions of cars than to switch over to biking or electric vehicles.
All right, and that concludes our debate on climate change. Good job, you guys. Nice work. So for the audience, we're going to vote at the end of all three of the debates. We're now going to move on to guns. And for gun policy, College Republicans, you're going to get to start this one. You have 1 minute and 30 seconds. Of course, yeah. Get yourself set up.
We're running out of time. We're running out of time.
No, we're doing open.
It's like refreshing.
Yes. No.
Alright, so first and foremost, we are committed to protecting every American's Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms and to protect themselves from any threat, whether it's a criminal or a tyrannical government. Our country faces a serious problem with guns today. We just do not believe that guns are the reason for that problem. Our country has had guns throughout its entire history, and this has become an issue in just recent years. We believe that we have a mental health crisis on our hands. Statistics show that 2/3 of mass shooters showed signs of mental health issues, and most of those showed warning signs before the incident occurred. We would support background checks to make sure that nobody who has a criminal history or a history of mental health can obtain the guns, because that would help limit mass shootings. Also, if you look to the rest of the world, you could see the dire consequences of gun bans in like authoritarian regimes like Venezuela we just saw a few months ago, where the government was running people over with tanks and they had no way to defend themselves. Also in the UK, they banned guns and they experienced elevated levels of crime, including homicide, immediately post-gun ban. So we believe that in order to drive down crime, it's better for people to take matters into their own hands to protect themselves.
Alright, so every day hundreds of people die from gun-related deaths across the US. It's a tragedy that is uniquely American, and its depth and spread in a society such as ours. It's no question that gun violence is a problem, but the real question is how do we solve it? The public widely supports the use of so-called red flag laws that ensure that guns get taken away or restricted from individuals that are seen as suspect or risky in order to reduce potential and future violence. And one of the most important points that we would like to talk about is how the issue of having guns in a house without any, say, background checks or mental health checks could lead to people using guns in ways that aren't meant to, like in the case of suicide, where 6 out of 10 gun deaths are suicides. Along with that, Americans are dissatisfied with the current system that we have right now, with the large-scale inaction of our federal government. Because of this, states are taking the initiative of enacting more expensive background checks and closing loopholes left open by the federal government, such as purchases at gun shows or close family or friends. We know that this isn't going to be solved by just a single solution, that there has to be a range of different solutions that we have to take in order to fix the issues that we have at hand. And all right.
Sure. In light of the fact that someone bothered to put this into the Second Amendment of the Constitution, it wasn't just some fly-by-night thing, and can anyone think of any positive things about guns, defensive use of guns, or any reason why citizens should be armed? Anybody?
Well, the Second Amendment was drafted in a time right after the entire revolution, where open militias were trying to defend their rights and what they believed in a new fledgling country. Of course, guns were one of the best defensive measures, and they still are for household purposes. It's just, I'm pretty sure that in the idea of framing the Constitution, it wasn't thought that a single gun in a single home would be capable of murdering quite literally dozens of people at a given time. It's, of course, has many benefits to being able to have a society that has the right to be able to bear arms. It allows for freedom of hunting, and it gives many people a sense of security at home. It's more so when it's a risk to others in society that it becomes a real threat.
I would just like to point out that canons existed at the time the Second Amendment was written, and the founders definitely knew that people could and did own cannons privately. So they did definitely account for, excuse me, firearms being able to kill multiple people at the same time. But the point isn't whether or not there is a crisis. We both agree that there is. It's what we should do about it. And we think instead of using the government to force people to comply with laws that restrict their rights and restrict their right to self-defense specifically, we should focus more time and resources on mental health infrastructure and actually make sure that the government communicates with itself to ensure that citizens who shouldn't own guns, such as the Las Vegas shooter because he was dishonorably discharged from the Air Force, that government agencies communicate with each other so that people who shouldn't already own guns don't. Currently, we are at or near record high levels for depression rates and anxiety rates in society, and more mental health infrastructure would be the solution to this, not just restricting the rights of innocent civilians.
The incidence of veterans who were trained to use guns, who come back from war and kill themselves, has gotten kind of astronomical. Do you have any good solutions for that? Because they also find that if a gun is in the home, somebody who's depressed, who might just yell and scream and whatever, if a gun is in the home, then they're more likely to use it.
Yeah, it's definitely a tragedy that that's becoming increasing.
It's a personal tragedy.
It definitely is. It's something that we need to work on as a nation to fix. I think that a combination of increased mental health funding and a better infrastructure, specifically with the VA in this case, would be able to help with that. But in the event that somebody has proven to be unstable mentally and proven themselves to be a danger to themselves and possibly to others if they were to own a gun, then I don't know specifically how the judicial process works, but I'm pretty sure that you could get a court order of some sort to stop a person who would be a danger to themselves and others from...
On a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, on a case-by-case basis, definitely, because once you establish a legal precedent for an entire class of people to have their right to self-defense through the Second Amendment restricted, not only is that pretty discriminatory and goes against the spirit of American law in general, but it also opens you up for the judicial expansion of that.
So, in terms of mental health, it has been shown that having longer wait times in order to purchase a gun has actually reduced the amounts of suicides in people, because it gives them a little bit more breathing room to like think about, should I actually go through with this? Should I actually buy this and like commit the deed? Along with, I agree that we should have better mental health infrastructure, but in the cases where people absolutely should not have a gun because it would be a danger to themselves and potentially to others, in those specific cases we should have stricter either background checks or mental health checks specifically in order to ensure that the people who are at risk don't get the guns that could cause a tragedy to themselves or others.
Okay, I want to recast this. When we think about mental illness, it's actually more likely for people who suffer from mental illness to be on the end of gun violence versus the perpetrator of gun violence. So you all have both said that in mass shootings there's indications of this, but on day-to-day violence that occurs, people who suffer from mental illness are actually more likely to be the victims in this case. So setting aside the issue of mental illness, what is it that you would like to change in gun policy in the United States? You can go first.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this is our platform, that if you were to own a rifle or any other type of firearm, you should at the very least know how to use it. Go to some kind of education class, know what parts of the rifle or gun are which, and that would help definitely, I think, to reduce the amount of accidental deaths and accidental discharges that happen. Not only that, but every individual who owns a firearm needs to take it upon themselves to properly and responsibly store it inside of some kind of metal cabinet that is locked so that nobody who isn't supposed to be in there, it gets in there. Not only that, but I think that the more people of a population that are armed and responsibly armed generally, the less likely somebody is to try and commit crimes against that population. It just makes sense logically that somebody would not try to commit violence against another if they thought that that person would defend themselves in kind.
And Democrats?
An issue with the current gun policy is the fact that many gun owners buy their guns from the private sector where you can circumvent the background checks and all of that. And what you're saying in terms of mental health reform, that wouldn't really address that problem because essentially they're just going behind the government's back and doing what they want. Also, banning like certain automatic weapons, even semi-automatic weapons. There's really no there's really no reason your average American needs an automatic gun. Even people who suffer from gun-related incidents, they don't have time to pull out their gun, let alone even address if there's a mall shooting. You don't know who the perpetrator is. You don't know who the good guy is. So it really just leads to more pandemonium at the end of the day. And the emphasis on mental health is just not nearly sufficient to address that.
Okay, and now you'll have the opportunity to ask each other questions. College Democrats, what questions did you prepare for the Republicans?
So you mentioned earlier that you'd like to invest in mental health reform. However, I find that rather unorthodox just because the current health care system fails to meet a multitude of basic needs, and even more than 60% of Republicans are in favor of repealing Obamacare, which addresses a lot of healthcare needs. So how can you claim to invest in mental health care when we can't even address the basic needs?
Well, you said it yourself, 60% of Republicans want to repeal Obamacare and want to restrict access to services for many Americans. But I personally am part of the 40% that doesn't want to do that. I say that I am pro-life, and I don't just mean with abortion, I mean with people's lives in general. If there's something that we can do to help people in general, then we should do it. In this case specifically, it's talking about increasing funding for existing social service centers. I'm not an expert on how that system works, but the logic goes that if we were to give it more funding, it would be able to do its job better, and it would be able to hire more staff so that it could do its job better. But other than that, I really don't have specifics. I'm not an expert on mental health. I don't claim to be, but it's definitely something in my view that, like you said, it's in a pretty poor condition right now, and if we want to see some kind of change happen, considering the rates of anxiety and depression in our society, we need to make the system better.
All right, and what question did you prepare for the Democrats?
So our lawmakers have been implementing more and more gun control for years and years, and gun violence and gun deaths still exist, and it's getting worse. Especially in places like Chicago and those inner cities, gun control hasn't done anything to help anyone. So why do you believe that adding more of the same gun control is going to make any difference, and would you make any changes to gun control that you think would actually work?
Well, for the specific example of Chicago and a lot of inner cities, a lot of the gun violence in Chicago, a lot of the guns illegally acquired in Chicago are often acquired by driving over the border to Indiana, where a lot of the standards are much lower for actually acquiring a gun, and so they do use that to get around there. And that's actually part of why we're arguing for a federal standard to be established so that these kind of circumventions can't occur. Additionally, additional things such as, for example, mental health things would probably help, and also checking for things like, again, criminal background checks, mental health checks, but also checks for certain like extremist ideologies, or not extremist ideologies necessarily, but checks for like Nicholas Cruz. Let's take him for example. If you asked anyone he knew whether he should have a gun, they would have said no. So even though more gun control has been implemented, a lot of it hasn't been implemented correctly or hasn't had enforcement done correctly. Thank you.
All right, you'll have a minute to collect your thoughts, and then we'll have closing statements.
You have 6 next semester.
You're not full time then. What are you gonna do?
Start grad school.
Yeah, start grad
Graduated twice.
Alright, College Democrats, you will get to go first. You have 45 seconds.
We agree that mental health is an important conversation to be had in trying to curb gun violence in America, but it is only one piece of the puzzle. If more extensive background checks and more individuals were implemented, hundreds of thousands of lives would be able to be saved every year. 75% of Americans, both gun owners, NRA members, Democrats, Republicans, support expanding background checks and making them universal and more thorough. Most of the proposals you talked about today were brought up in either Congress in this session or in previous sessions, but were voted down by a large number of Republicans. And so we don't believe that we're against the Second Amendment. We're just trying to ensure that the maximum number of Americans can be saved from possible gun violence.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The right to keep and bear arms is a transcendental right. It does not come from man. Every person should be able to defend themselves and their family. Now, there's a lot of fear-mongering going on the left saying there's a gun in the household, there's going to be harm that comes to that. But we need to focus more on the beneficial use of firearms. There's 15,000 homicides per year versus 2.5 million successful uses of self-defensive gun use. Take Stephen Williford, for example. The gunman who opened up in Sutherland Springs, Texas, was stopped by an American with a legally owned AR-15. In addition, guns cannot go away. They're going to be here no matter what you try to do. And these red flag laws are dangerous because they can be weaponized, and they're unconstitutional.
And that concludes our debate on guns. Nice work. Okay, we're gonna do immigration. You know how they started it and did the last one, and you started it and did that? They're gonna start this one, and we're gonna end this Are you guys ready? All right, we're going to go on to our third and final debate. The topic is immigration.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. It has become a mere fictitious statement under the Trump administration. Illegal immigrants are part of our community. In 2017, there were more than 10 million people that are labeled as illegal. Also, dreamers shouldn't be punished for their parents' transgressions. They were babies when their parents crossed the border, and yet Mr. Trump insists that we should repeal DACA, and then what happens to those kids? Do they just get removed or then relocated to a country they've never been to? The system is broken, it's backlogged, and it needs immediate fixing. Under the detainer program, ICE has requested law enforcement to make 2 million illegal arrests, which is based on the Supreme Court case in 2016. So basically, ICE contacts local authorities and asks them to share information about people they arrest and whether or not they are illegal. And then a lot of people end up being deported that way, and there's like no due process and has been deemed illegal. The DREAM Act has been expanded, or the House passed its expansion in 2019, and a lot of Republicans are not in favor of the DREAM Act, which would essentially allow dreamers a path to citizenship. They are part of our community, and the more that we work on excluding them, the more that we hurt our economy. After all, this country was built on immigration. How can you say that one person is more entitled to being here than another?
Thank you for the opening quote from the plaque by the Statue of Liberty. Personally, all of my ancestors who came to this country were immigrants. I can say with certainty that the same is true for most of us in this room today. We are not anti-immigrant. We do not hate people because of their country of origin. However, the government of the United States of America exists solely to defend the interests of American citizens and those who cross the border illegally. Those who do not register themselves with the United States of America are not American citizens and therefore are not protected by the American government. However, specifically with regards to border security, the point isn't to end immigration. We realize the benefits that immigration has brought to the United States, both through cultural diversification and a lot of inventions and scientific advancements that have been created by immigrants. We recognize that and we appreciate that. However, we think that given the current climate in the United States of America, this security is necessary to stop systemic and systematic abuse of our amnesty laws, our our system of welfare in the United States. Not only that, but the fact that there are multiple millions of undocumented people in the United States who are willing to work and willing to provide for themselves and others drives the cost of American labor down, which ultimately hurts our economy.
I have a lot of questions.
Just one.
How about
Just
one?
one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Give us your best one.
A lot of people have argued that who we allow to immigrate is often motivated by racial or other discriminatory ideas. And how would you respond to that? Who we allow to come in, and that, that's kind of problematic. So, there were signs saying no Irish need apply at one time in the 19th century. Italian Americans were discriminated against, Jewish Americans were discriminated against, and now many people believe that Mexican Americans are being discriminated against, but other people from other countries are allowed to come in, and why are we restricting so many from Latin American countries?
Sure. So, one of the primary actions undertaken by the Trump administration has been to try to enact some sort of merit-based immigration system, similar to what I believe they have in Australia. It discriminates against less skilled immigrants and tries to prioritize those who speak English, who have a higher education, and really targets the audience of who would have a better chance of immigrating to the United States. Because of that, it goes contrary to many of the waves of immigrants the United States has laid home to, where most come in as unskilled and low-paid wage working. Historically, yes, and even till today, in some degrees. But they represent a backbone of the American economy, and only having highly skilled workers isn't necessarily the best route for immigration in the country as a whole. We should be able to accept people of all types of backgrounds, indiscriminate of what they can give to our economy.
And I would argue that there is one large piece that is missing. We are the most diverse country on the planet, and it seems odd that it would be wrong for us to, unlike every other country in the world that does do the same thing we do as far as discriminating based on skills and work, why it would be wrong for us to do it, whereas every other country in the world is allowed to. And then also, I think that the fact of the matter is that a majority of the immigrants who happen to be illegal do come from Mexico, but that is because we have a gigantic land border with Mexico. I think we all would be entirely against everyone from Canada coming down, but it's just a matter of circumstance that we are right next to the border with Mexico. And I think we should have the ability to immigration. Immigrants make us all better, but there are laws in this country that we made for ourselves, and someone moving in and open defiance to that law, for whatever reason, still erodes our laws in general.
Okay, if, as long as for immigration, if there's going to be a country and if there are going to be borders, let me ask my usual question again, which is, does anyone see any advantage to having laws about immigration and following those laws?
So we believe it is important to have laws about immigration and to ensure that people do come in a neat and orderly fashion. As a point of notice, you made mention of people coming from Canada. A large number of illegal immigrants are not just people who come in from Mexico, but they're actually just people who overstay their visa and just come down from the Canadian border. So it's not just a problem of our southern border. In regards to having whole-scale immigration laws, it's designed to protect Americans from possible dangers. Of course, people go around the system and don't follow the rules, but those rules are incredibly restrictive at the moment and have been getting more and more restrictive of late. And it becomes a real hassle for a family to have to decide that if waiting 17 years to immigrate legally is the best option for them. It becomes hard, so. Yes.
So we think it is very important to have strong immigration laws and to actually enforce them. Like we said before, we're 100% pro-legal immigrant. It's not about stopping people who are hardworking, who want to come here, start a life for their family. It's about stopping criminals, drugs, terrorists, whoever it is who's trying to get into this country and do bad things. The other thing you have to consider is that these immigrants and the illegal immigrants and the criminals, when they come over the border, they're most likely going to end up in the same neighborhood or at least near each other. So by having strong border security, you're helping the legal immigrants get ahead, because if you just let anyone come over the border, they're going to come in, and then the immigrant communities are going to be run with crime and terrorists and drugs, and they're not going to be able to succeed here in America. The other thing you have to consider is the cost of illegal immigration. It costs the country billions of dollars every year with illegal immigrants not paying taxes, using the welfare system, the police having to go and bust all the drug cartels who made it into the country. If we can just stop all that at the border, it helps us, it helps the legal immigrants.
Okay, so the last big amnesty that was granted for immigrants was under President Ronald Reagan, granting 5 million immigrants amnesty in the U.S. Why should or shouldn't we do that now for the 11 or so million who exist here today?
We should definitely grant amnesty to the current immigrants in the U.S. simply because what else is there to do? What do we stand to lose? What is the opportunity cost of not doing so? Immigrants are people. We all came from somewhere. They contribute to the economy. They pay taxes. And even if they don't receive social benefits, if they work a job, that income is taxable. So they're still giving back to the U.S. economy without receiving anything in return. Furthermore, if we provide them with amnesty, we set a precedent. We follow what our ancestors wanted us to follow. However, if we say, oh, this person, I'm not saying felons or anyone who has committed a crime deserves to be here or should be granted any kind of leniency. However, I am saying that people who have been here, people who have been law-abiding citizens, people who have an iffy status right now in terms of their residency, they're not going to go out of their way to commit crimes. They're not going to go out of their way to become crime perpetrators. In fact, most immigrant communities are not infested with crime compared to non-immigrant communities.
So, under the premise of amnesty, we are not necessarily against amnesty for illegal immigrants. I think it would benefit them to be citizens and be able to be part of the country that they are currently living in, and benefit us all with the skills that they have. But the main thing is that we are a country that has borders and we have laws. And simply granting amnesty to one group of people doesn't necessarily stop the illegal immigration issue. You just make it so that eventually in a few years you're going to add more people. So we'd rather it be that we are all for amnesty, under the stipulation that our borders are secure and we have a specific way of knowing who comes in, where they go, and whatever, be that visa overstay or be that someone who crosses the border legally.
Okay. And what question did you all prepare for the College Democrats?
Go first, please.
Sure, do you guys have a question for the College Democrats?
So one of the most contentious portions of the Trump administration has been his advocacy for a border barrier of some sort across the southern border into Mexico, whereas the number one claim as to its purpose, which did shift over time, was to stop drugs from coming in from countries south of our border. When they come in mainly from ports of entry, why is it a strategic move to spend $6.1 billion on the border barrier when its purpose isn't very clearly defined, nor is it seemingly practical to stop what it was designed for.
Well, let me just counter that. The purpose of a physical barrier is self-evident. It's to stop something from one side getting to the other side. That is clear. The benefit of it, though, comes when you think about how much money that states and the federal government spend on subsidizing things for illegal immigrants. Because actually, there was a Supreme Court case a while back, I don't remember it off the top of my head, but illegal immigrants can and do receive things such as health care and education on the taxpayer dollar. So if you build a structure there on the southern border to stop land-based immigration, and you man that structure, and you regulate entry into the United States on that border through regular ports of entry, the amount of illegal immigrants crossing that border would logically fall because they wouldn't be able to get around the manned structure, and if they did, they would be detained by the Border Patrol agent manning it.
All right, and do you all have a question for the Democrats?
In the case of illegal immigration, would you support any form of border security measure?
Just like an experience question.
Well, and what would those measures be?
Well, the short answer to that is yes. We do believe that there should be border security. It's an important part to ensure that those American citizens and American nationals are safe living along the border. But it comes down to effective uses of border technology. Having a physical barrier in the middle of the desert isn't necessarily the best option. Increasing personnel along a port of entry or increasing the types of technology that can be used along popular crossing areas would go a lot further, and it's a wonder why money such as that has not been allocated through Congress in a more appropriate fashion, given the severity given to it by certain groups.
Okay, you'll have a minute to collect your thoughts, and then you'll have closing.
No, I actually did. To do like the minus the three, where it's like integral.
College Democrats, you will have 45 seconds to close, and then we'll end with the college Republicans.
So the issue with immigration is that DACA has been super restrictive. There's a lot of criteria about who is able to fall under that. You had to have had a high school degree or a GED. You had to have been here for at least 4 years, or you had to have come here when you were a child. So it's not like it's just anyone gets to fall under that criteria. Additionally, if we were to end DACA, we would suffer a loss of $400 million in the. So integrating people who are already here is a good thing. So even if we don't care about it morally, having them integrated benefits the economy, which in turn benefits everyone. However, people who are trying to cross illegally should be apprehended. They should have to go through the system. Obama was nicknamed Deporter-in-Chief because he deported so many people. In fact, he deported more people than Trump. The way Trump is going about it is just having ICE create tension between local communities and the federal government.
College Republicans?
Just to begin with, you mentioned before that building a wall in the desert wouldn't really do anything. The wall does work. The wall has worked in overseas. Israel and Hungary both built walls on their respective borders, and it decreased immigration by like 99%. The wall that was just built in San Diego, all the Border Patrol agents say it's helping to curb illegal immigration greatly, and you keep talking about DACA, but the problem with DACA and amnesty is that it doesn't actually solve the problem, because all these people came in because we don't have enough border security. So if you say to them, okay, like, you're good, well, more people are just going to keep coming in 20 years, we're going to be having the same debate and nothing is ever going to get solved. That's why we feel like we need to have border security, but for the people who are here, DACA, illegal immigrants, we would support a path to citizenship for them. And, yeah, I ran out of time.
All right, and that is our third and final debate. Nice job.
So, on behalf of both the Republicans and the College Democrats, I just want to thank you guys for coming out tonight. Feel free to take pizza and drinks from the back, and also, if you have not signed in, please do come up front and sign in. We're on the laptop that is probably
It's right over there somewhere.
going to be here. Yes.